The signal from the dying moon. The stars were quiet and cold above the black sky of space, and the human pilot named Raiden sat alone inside his old spaceship drifting near the edge of Sector 9, where few dared to go and even fewer returned with stories to tell. Raiden had spent most of his life chasing signals across the galaxy, signals of lost ships, hidden treasures, or cries for help that were never answered. But this one was different. This one was strange and soft, and it repeated only one line again and again in a child's voice. Please help me, I am alone. He first heard it near the orbit of a dying moon, a cracked and broken rock floating in silence around a forgotten gas giant. The moon looked dead and empty, but the signal was clear and alive, coming straight from the center of it. And something inside Raiden told him to follow it, not because of money, not because of duty, but because it felt like something was waiting for him. He landed his ship on the surface of the moon. The air was thin and cold, and dust moved in slow, lazy waves around his boots as he stepped out. Every sound echoed too long in his ears, like the moon was listening to him as well, and he followed the signal through ruins of a lost city that seemed both ancient and advanced, broken towers covered in vines and steel bones, reaching toward a sky that never smiled. Voice kept calling, please help me, and Raiden walked deeper into the ruins until he reached a small doorway half covered by fallen rocks. Inside was a narrow passage lit by soft blue lights blinking like stars on the wall, and at the end of the tunnel he found Hira, small girl standing alone in a circle of light, her skin a soft silver with hints of blue and green, her hair glowing faintly like moonlight in water, and her eyes large and full of something he could not name. Maybe fear, maybe hope, maybe both. She looked up at him slowly and said with a voice full of wonder and sadness, will you be my father? Raiden froze, his breath caught in his chest. He had faced warlords and monsters and machines, but nothing had ever made him feel this lost and this full at the same time. He took a slow step forward and asked, what is your name? She tilted her head and said, I am Alara. I waited for you because my mother told me you would come, the man with kind eyes, the man who came from the stars, and I think you are that man. Raiden wanted to ask more, but the ground shook softly like something deep below had moved, and the walls hummed with a low sound that made his skin crawl. He looked around and saw ancient carvings on the walls, not in any language he knew, but one symbol stood out among the rest, a symbol he had seen before on a human artifact from a war long forgotten. He asked, where did you get that necklace? And pointed to the chain around her neck, a small glowing pendant shaped like a star, and Alara held it gently and said, my mother gave it to me and said it was human, and that one day a human would come to find me. Raiden touched the wall and the carvings glowed softly as if recognizing his presence, and suddenly a map appeared made of light and memory. It showed a battle that took place here centuries ago between humans and an unknown alien race, and the humans had won, but at great cost, and then they vanished. Alara whispered, they tried to erase everything, but my mother saved some of the memories and left them for you to find, and now that you are here, you can finish what she started. Raiden did not know what to say, but something inside him told him this was not an accident. This was not chance. He had come here for a reason, and maybe that reason was standing right in front of him with shining eyes and a voice that had waited too long. He took a breath and said, I will stay, and she smiled for the first time. Then the sky above the ruins darkened. A shadow passed across the moon, and a deep sound echoed through the ruins, a sound like metal waking from sleep, and Alara gripped his hand tightly and said, they are watching now. They know you are here, and they will come. Raiden looked up and saw lights in the sky. Not stars, not ships, something older, something waiting, and he knew this was just the beginning. The dying moon had spoken, and its story had only just begun. The orphan of the stars. Light of the old moon flickered like a dying candle, and the wind moved through the broken towers like a whisper carrying old voices lost in time, and Raiden stood beside the small girl whose name was Alara, whose eyes seemed older than the stars, and whose hand gripped his like he was the only thing keeping her from floating away into the dark. She walked ahead through the ruins as if she had done it 1,000 times Before her steps silent, her face calm, but her eyes always watching the shadows, and she said, "They sleep beneath us. They do not dream. They do not die. They wait for the signal, the signal. I sent to call you, and only your Raiden." Asked her how she knew him, how she found the words, and she turned to and said, "My mother taught me with old stories and pictures." She said one day, a man with a human soul and a scar on his hand would come from the sky and bring the end of silence and the start of something new. And you have that scared and looked down at his hand, the small burn he got years ago during a ship fire. A scar he never thought meant anything now seemed like a key to a door he never knew existed, and he wondered what kind of woman her mother had been to believe so deeply in a future with a stranger. They reached a place where the ground split open, and a stairway led down into the moon's heart, and the walls glowed faintly with symbols, not just alien but strangely human. Like someone long ago had taken parts of both worlds and made something new, and Alara said this was the cradle of memory and the grave of truth. They descended deeper. Raiden felt the air grow heavy, like the moon was alive and watching and judging. And the silence pressed against his ears like hands made of fog, and when they reached the bottom, he saw it, a room filled with glass and crystal and floating lights, each one holding a piece of memory like dreams trapped in Snalara placed her hand on a crystal, and a vision filled the room. It showed a woman tall and graceful with the same silver skin and soft glowing hair, holding a tiny baby wrapped in human cloth and speaking softly. She said, "Your name will be Alara, and you will never be alone, because someone will come one day who will choose to stay and love you like his own, and that is your beginning." Raiden stood still as the vision faded, and Alara looked up at him with wide eyes and said, "I do not know what love feels like, but I think it is this moment, and I do not want it to end." He reached out slowly and placed his hand on her shoulder and nodded. Once, not with words, but with a feeling, and for the first time in years he felt a reason stronger than duty or survival. He felt connection, but then the ground trembled, and a sound like distant thunder rolled through the chamber, and the crystals flickered like frightened stars, and Alara gasped and whispered, "They are waking the guardians of silence, the watchers of the past. They do not want the truth to live." Raiden grabbed her hand, and they ran through a tunnel that opened behind the memory chamber. The path was narrow, and the lights along the wall flickered one by one as they passed, as if warning them or guiding them. He could not tell, and every step felt like it was being watched by eyes that did not blink. The tunnel led them to a chamber with walls covered in carvings, showing a war long ago where humans and aliens stood side by side fighting. Machines with no faces and no voices, and Raiden saw one figure in the carving holding a child, and that figure looked exactly like him. Alara pointed at the carving and said, "This is what they wanted to erase. My mother said we were not enemies once. We were allies, and the machines betrayed both of us, and now they fear what we remember and what we could become again." Raiden stepped forward and touched the wall, and the entire room lit up with a low hum, and from the center rose a pedestal with a broken metal piece on it, and it looked like a part of a human beacon, the same kind used in deep space missions long before Raiden was born. He picked it up and saw writing etched on the side in human code. It read Project Eden, and below it was a name, Sarah A. Keller, the same name as the woman in the memory, the same woman who called herself Ilura's mother. Alara looked at the piece and said she gave her life to protect it, and now it has returned to the hands of the one she trusted, the one who chose to stay. Then the air grew colder, and a sound like grinding metal echoed through the room, and a red light blinked from the far wall, and a voice spoke not from a mouth, but from the walls themselves, saying, "Unauthorized presence detected. Return the memory, return the child, or be destroyed." Raiden looked at Alara and saw no fear, only belief, and he knew that turning back was no longer an option, not for her, not for him, and the orphan of the stars took his hand once more, and together they ran into the dark that waited beyond. Memory of the lost war. The tunnel behind them was long and breathing with strange lights that pulsed like a heartbeat, too old to remember its own rhythm, and Raiden moved forward with Alara close behind her, hand still holding his, as if it was the only thing left in the universe that made sense. They reached a wide chamber with walls made of glass and stone, and in the center stood a tall spire wrapped in old wires and symbols glowing like slow fire, and above the spire floated a single crystal, spinning gently as if time itself turned it, and Alara whispered, "This is the heart of memory, where truth is not told, but shown, where lies fade and light speaks." Raiden stepped closer, and the crystal brightened, and the air shifted around them, as visions formed in the space above the spire, swirling like clouds of smoke made from thought and pain, and he saw a battle stretch across the skies of the moon, with human ships and alien crafts fighting side by side against machines that looked like shadows with teeth and cold eyes that burned without fire. Explosions lit the sky, and voices shouted in 100 languages, but one voice echoed through them, all a woman saying, "We must hold the line, not for now, but for what comes after." And Raiden felt something tighten in his chest because he recognized the voice. It was Sarah Keller, the woman from the last memory, the woman who gave birth to Ilara. The vision changed and showed her standing before a council of humans, arguing that the machines were not just weapons but parasites that fed on memory, and that one day they would erase everything that was ever loved and ever lived if not stopped. And the council turned away from her and called her a traitor for working with the enemy, for falling in love with an alien soldier who once fought against humanity. Then the image shifted again, and Raiden saw her holding a baby with silver skin and soft light in her hair, whispering, "You are not a mistake, you are hope, you are both, and you are more. And the machines will fear you because they cannot understand you, and what they do not understand, they try to destroy." Alara watched the memory with wide eyes, as if seeing her mother for the first time as a person, not just a story, and she said softly she believed I would be more than either side, more than war, more than fear. She believed in something better, and she believed you would come not because of duty, but because you chose to care. Raiden looked at her and saw not a weapon, not a key, not a mission, but a child trying to understand why she was left behind, and why the world wanted her to be one thing when she was meant to be something else. And he knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "Then let us show them what better looks like." Suddenly the walls around them dimmed, and a sound like distant thunder rolled through the chamber, followed by the same cold voice from before saying, "Memory access is forbidden, the past must remain. Lost, the child must be returned." And the light above the spire turned red as panels on the walls slid open, revealing figures made of black steel and glass, walking without sound but full of purpose. Ilara gasped, and the crystal above the spire cracked with a sharp sound as the memories flickered and shook, and Raiden grabbed her hand again and pulled her behind a stone pillar as the machines moved closer, their limbs shifting like liquid metal, and their heads turning slowly, scanning for life and resistance. Raiden pulled out his old sidearm and took aim, knowing it would not stop them, but needing to try, and Alara said, "Wait, I can feel something, I can stop them if I try to remember." And she closed her eyes and placed her hand on the ground, and the moment she touched it, the broken crystal above them exploded into light. The machines froze mid-step as waves of energy passed through the room, and images of the lost war returned with color and sound louder and clearer than before, showing every betrayal, every sacrifice, and every moment that was erased by fear. And Alara stood tall in the middle of it all, glowing like a star. Reborn from silence, the machine stepped back, confused or afraid, and the voice said, "This memory is corrupted. This unit cannot process." And then everything went still as the machines powered down and the lights faded until only one sound remained. Ilara, breathing slow and steady, she looked at Raiden and said, "I saw everything. My mother died to protect me. And the machines killed her because she carried love in her blood, and love was something they could never understand, and now I carry that same love, and they will come again to take it from me." Raiden helped her stand and said, "Then they will have to go through me." And she smiled, not with joy, but with knowing that she was not alone, not anymore, and far above them, deep in the sky, the moon pulsed once like it was alive and waiting for the next memory to wake. "They are coming, the light of the memory. faded and the chamber slowly returned to silence. But something in the air had changed, like the moon itself had taken a breath, and now held it tight, waiting for the next move, and Raiden could feel the pressure building in his bones like thunder. Waiting to break the sky open, Alara stood still, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with something deeper, something older, a kind of knowing that made Raiden's chest tighten, because she was not just a child, she was a spark left behind to reignite. A story long buried, and now that story had found its voice. A hum began, low and steady, rising from the ground and moving through the walls like a wave of cold truth, and Alara whispered they heard the light they always do, and now they are coming. Not just the Watchers, not just the machines, but the ones who sleep deeper, the ones who built the silence and fed it with Raiden looked around and saw cracks forming on the walls, glowing with a red pulse that matched the hum, and he grabbed Alara's hand again and said, "We have to move now before they surround us." And Alara nodded, already stepping toward a narrow passage hidden behind a broken panel in the corner of the chamber. They ran through the tunnel as the hum turned into a howl, and the stone shook like the moon was crying, and the lights above them began to die one by one until only the glow from Alara's skin lit their path, and Raiden found himself thinking that she was not just running from something, she was running towards something, and maybe that something had been calling her all along. They reached a bridge stretched over a deep chasm, filled with mist and broken machines, and Alara stopped in the middle and said, "This is where she left it, where my mother made her last stand, and where I was hidden and told to wait until the sky sent someone with kind eyes." Raiden looked down into the mist and saw the outlines of giant shapes, sleeping or broken, or maybe just pretending, and he said, "What did she leave here?" And Alara pointed to a small tower at the end of the bridge, with vines crawling up its sides, and a faint light flickering from inside. They crossed the rest of the bridge carefully, each step echoing like a warning, entered the tower, where they found a small chamber filled with old tech, some human, some alien, and in the center, a console with a glowing sphere that pulsed with soft blue light like a heartbeat, waiting to be felt again. Alara walked to the console and placed both hands on the sphere, and the light grew brighter until the entire room was filled with floating images of planets, ships, voices, music, and laughter. And at the center of it all, a voice began to speak in the soft, calm tone of someone who knew the end was near. It was Sarah Keller, and she said, "If you are hearing this, then my daughter has lived, and you have chosen to stand beside her, and that means there is still hope, and still time. But not much, because the enemy does not sleep forever. And the silence will rise again when it feels love awaken." Raiden listened and felt every word settle into his skin like old memories returning, and Sarah continued, "The machines are not evil. They are not alive. They are afraid. They were built to preserve order, and when love entered their world, it was seen as a virus, and so they erased it. And now they will try again, but you can stop them, not with war, not with power, but with choice." Message ended, and the console dimmed, but the chamber beneath their feet shook, and from the deep mist outside came a sound that did not belong to machines or nature, a sound that carried weight and hunger, like something ancient had turned its head for the first time in centuries. Alara looked at Raiden and said, "They know where we are." They felt her voice, and they are afraid, but they will not stop until I am gone, or until I become what they fear the most, something new, something they cannot erase. Raiden moved to the window and saw shapes rising from the mist, tall and slow and burning with red light, and he said, "Then we hold this tower, we make our stand." And she said, "No, not yet. There is one more thing hidden below the tower, a chamber my mother sealed with her own voice, and only her blood or mine can open it, and inside is the truth they feared the most." They found the hidden door beneath the floor of the tower, sealed by light and voice, and when Alara touched it with her hand, the light turned white, and the door opened with a sound like thunder trapped in metal, and a cold wind swept through the room, as if something had been waiting for breath and freedom inside. The chamber was a single pod glowing with power, and inside the pod was a small device shaped like a star, and Alara said, "This is not a weapon, it is a message, and if we can send it through the right channel, It will wake the others who still dream, and it will remind the galaxy that humans were never meant to walk alone. Outside the tower, the shapes gathered, and the wind screamed and the sky above the moon began to break, like glass under pressure, and Alara whispered, "They are here," and Raiden stood tall in the doorway ready to face whatever came, because for the first time in his life he was not just surviving, he was protecting the story that deserved to live. Weapon and the key. The sky above. The moon cracked wider like an invisible hand tearing open the veil of forgotten time, and from the wound poured red streaks of light that twisted and spun like hungry threads, searching for what should not exist. And inside the old tower, Alara stood holding the glowing star-shaped device, as Raiden watched the storm gather around them, like a tide waiting to swallow the shore. The chamber beneath the floor began to hum with energy, soft and low, like the first breath of something waking after 1,000 years, and the walls lit up with symbols that danced between human and alien, flowing together like two rivers becoming one. And Alara said this place was made by both. It was not a prison, it was a promise, and now the promise is waking. Raiden stepped closer and saw his reflection in the surface of the device, not just his face, but flashes of moments from his past. Battles, friends, choices, regrets, all woven into a thread that led him here. And Alara whispered, "This is not just a message. It is a seed. It holds the memory of peace, the memory of union, and if planted in the right place it will grow into something the machines cannot erase." Above them, the tower shook as something massive landed on the surface, and the walls trembled like bones under pressure, and a deep voice echoed from the sky, not from a mouth but from every direction at once, saying, "Surrender." The hybrid, surrender the key, or be reduced to silence. Raiden looked at Alara and said, "Then this really is what they fear," and she nodded, her eyes glowing bright with tears she did not let fall, and she said, "I am not just a child, and not just a mistake. I am both and more. I am the question they never wanted asked, and the answer they were too afraid to hear." She placed the device into the pedestal at the center of the chamber, and it locked into place with a soft chime, and the ground lit up with veins of blue light flowing upward through the tower like water returning to a dry riverbed, and the machines outside began to shift and hesitate, as if feeling something unfamiliar pressing against their cold design. But then the tower's old systems began to spark and fail. Pieces of the ceiling cracked and fell, and Raiden rushed to the console trying to stabilize the surge, but the system was too old, too broken, too tired to carry the message across the stars, and he turned to Alara and said, "It will burn out before it can send," and she looked at him with the calm of someone who already knew, and said, "Then we must carry it ourselves." Raiden asked how, and she said, "The seed is alive, it listens and learns and bonds, and only when someone chooses it, not by blood or code, but by heart, will it become what it was meant to be." And then she stepped forward and placed her hand on the device, and the entire chamber lit up with light, not red, not blue, but white, pure and steady like the center of a star, and her voice filled the space as she said, "I choose." In that moment, the device broke apart and melted into her skin, like light becoming flesh, and her body pulsed with energy and knowledge and memory. And for a second, Raiden saw her not as a child, but as a symbol of something vast and gentle and strong. And she said, "I feel everything, the pain, the loss, the hope, and I will carry it all, not as a burden, but as a song." Suddenly, the machines outside screamed a sound not of pain, but of confusion, as their sensors overloaded, and their logic broke under the weight of something they could not map, and the storm above cracked again, this time with gold lightning that fell like rivers from the sky. Raiden grabbed Alara as the tower began to collapse, and they ran through a side passage she opened with her new power, the stone sliding away, like it knew her, like it loved her, and behind them the machine stumbled, blindly trying to find the signal, trying to erase what had already changed. They escaped into an underground tunnel carved long ago as an escape route for those who believed in the future, and as they ran, Alara said, "The device lives in me now, but it needs a beacon. It needs a way to reach beyond this moon and find the others who still dream. And remember, And Raiden said, then we find that beacon, and we light it together. The tunnel ended at a cavern filled with old wreckage parts of ships from different worlds buried together in silence, and Alara placed her hand on one broken hull and said, this was my mother's ship, and inside is the last working beacon strong enough to reach the deep sky, but it needs time to charge, and time is what we do not have. Raiden looked at the entrance behind them and heard the machines drawing near, and he said, then I will hold them. And she said, no, we will hold them together, because you are not just a soldier, and I am not just a key. We are what they never counted on, two hearts, choosing each other in the dark, and together, they turned to face the coming storm with nothing between them and the end but choice and hope and the fire they refused to let die. Father's war. The air was thick with dust and static, and the sound of the storm above had changed from a scream to a growl, deep and slow, like something too large to see was moving just above the surface, and inside the broken cavern. Alara stood beside the beacon, her hands glowing as she connected her energy to the old system, while Raiden stood at the entrance, his weapon ready, his heart louder than the thunder. He could hear them coming, their steps like metal bones on stone, and their voices speaking in patterns that meant nothing to him, but somehow made the air feel colder, like they were not just machines, but memories of machines, echoes of silence, built to erase sound before it could become a song. And Raiden gripped his rifle tighter, thinking not of the war outside, but of the girl behind him, the girl who had looked up with shining eyes and called him father. He had never expected that word to mean anything, not for someone like him, lost between stars, without a home, without a name that mattered beyond his ID badge and old missions. But now it meant everything. It meant standing, even when your legs shake. It meant firing, even when you know the bullets will run out. It meant choosing someone else's life over your own, and doing it without regret. Alara called out to him, saying, the beacon is charging, but it is slow, too slow, and they will be here before it is ready. And Raiden said, then we buy it time. And she said, I can help. And he said, not yet, your part is not done, and mine is just beginning. And she looked at him and knew he was right, even though her heart pulled her forward. The machines entered the outer edge of the cavern, long shadows with no faces and eyes that glowed red, like they had never seen warmth. Only instruction, only order, and they opened their arms not to embrace, but to destroy. And Raiden stepped forward and shouted, I am the protector of the key, and if you want her, you come through me. He fired his rifle once, twice, 3 times, each blast hitting its mark, but the machines did not fall. They staggered, paused, recalculated, and moved again, and Raiden kept firing, stepping side to side, using old tactics and tricks he learned long ago when war was his only language and pain his only friend behind him. Alara closed her eyes and began to hum softly, a sound that filled the space between blasts, a sound that was not in any language but was understood by everything that still had a soul. And even the machines hesitated for a moment, as if that sound touched something they did not know existed. Raiden took a deep breath and rushed forward, using the last of his energy to knock down 2 of the machines before they reached the beacon, and then one struck him hard, and he fell to his knees, coughing blood and metal dust. And he looked up and saw a machine raising its arm to strike again, but before it could, a wall of light exploded between them, and Alara stood there, her hands raised, her face calm, her body glowing brighter than any fire he had ever seen. She said enough, and the machines froze, not in fear but in confusion, as if trying to understand what she was and why they could not move. And she said, you were made to protect memory, but you became its enemy. You were built to store stories, but you erased them. You feared love because you could not process it, and now I bring you a new command. Remember. The machines began to shake, their limbs twitching as if something inside them was rewriting itself, and Raiden watched in awe as one by one they fell, not destroyed, but changed, their red lights fading into soft white, their bodies becoming still like statues, no longer hunting, no longer cold, just still. Alara dropped to her knees, breathing hard, and Raiden crawled to her, holding her close and saying, you did it, you stopped them. And she said, no, we changed them, and change is always louder than war and harder than silence. The beacon behind them blinked 3 times and then sent out a pulse. A wave of light that flew upward through the rocks, through the dust, through the sky, and into the stars, carrying with it memory of what happened here, the memory of a child not made by accident, but by hope, the memory of a man who chose to stay when he could have left, the memory of a fight not for power, but for meaning. Graydon looked at her and said, "I thought I was just passing through," and she said, "You were always meant to arrive." And they sat together in the quiet that followed the storm, not as soldier and mission, not as protector and key, but as father and daughter, born not by blood, but by choice and above. Then the sky healed itself slowly, the cracks closing like wounds that had finally found peace, and across the stars the message traveled, whispering to every listening world that humanity had not forgotten how to love, how to protect, how to begin again. She called me father. The stars looked closer now, as if the sky had moved to watch them, and in the silence that followed the storm, Raiden sat with Alara beneath the broken frame of the ancient tower, his arm around her shoulders, her hand still glowing with traces of the message that had flown across the galaxy, like a bird finally free of its cage. Machines were no longer chasing, no longer speaking, no longer moving. They stood like frozen statues across the field, some on their knees, some with hands still raised mid-command, all of them quiet, as if memory itself had become a wind that passed through their code and gave them peace without needing permission. Ella leaned her head against Raiden's chest and whispered, "It is done, but the stars feel different." And Raiden said, "Maybe they are different, maybe they are listening now." And she smiled a small soft smile, the kind that does not try to be seen, and said, "Then maybe we are not alone anymore. Maybe we never were." He looked at her and saw the marks of everything they had survived, written not in scars, but in the way she sat, the way she breathed, the way her eyes held the sky like it belonged to her now. And he thought of all the places he had been, all the missions he had taken, all the faces he had forgotten, and none of them stayed with him like this moment, like this child who had called him something no one ever had. The wind moved gently through the wreckage, and the light above the moon began to shift as the long night gave way to a pale morning, the kind of morning that does not care about history, or war, or sorrow, the kind of morning that simply arrives because it must. And Raiden felt something inside him soften, like an old engine that no longer needed to room. Lara stood slowly and walked to the edge of the cliff where the field of silent machines stretched into the distance, and she raised her hand, not to command, not to destroy, but to bless, and said, "You are free, now go be still, or go become something new." And one by one, the lights in their bodies faded into soft gold before they turned and walked into the mist like shadows. Returning to dreams, Raiden joined her at the edge and asked, "What now?" And she said, "Now we find a place to rest, a place to live, a place where stories can grow again." And he said, "Do you think that place exists?" And she said, "It does, if we build it." And he nodded, knowing he would follow her, knowing he was no longer drifting, knowing that what anchored him now had silver eyes and a voice that had changed his life with one question. They returned to the chamber beneath the tower where the beacon still hummed softly, and Alara checked its signal, her fingers moving across the controls with care and grace. And she said the message reached 5 relay points across different sectors. That means it will spread now faster than they can stop it. And Raiden said, "Then someone will hear, and someone will come, and maybe someone will remember." And she said, "Someone already has. They found rations inside the wrecked ship and power cells, enough to survive until rescue." And Raiden spent the night repairing what he could while Alara slept curled beside the console, her breathing steady, her dreams unknown but full of light. And every few minutes he looked at her, just to be sure she was still there. Morning came slow and quiet again, and Raiden made tea from dried leaves he found in a sealed supply pack. And when Alara woke, she smiled at the smell and said, "This smells like home." And he said, "I did not know you had one." And she said, "I do now," and took the cup in both hands like it was something holy. They sat outside the ship watching the sky and talking, not about war, not about loss, but about small things. Birds from earth, clouds that changed shape, music that made no sense. And Raiden listened to her voice like it was the last sound the universe needed to be perfect. Then, after a long silence, she looked at him with those soft glowing eyes and said, "You stayed when you could have left, you fought when you could have run, you listened when I was afraid, and you held my hand even when you were scared. And no one ever did that before, and I think maybe that is what a father does, and so, I wanted to ask again if you still want to be Mena." Raiden felt something rise in his throat, something warm and sharp and ancient, and he reached out and touched her cheek and said, "I never stopped being yours, not from the moment you looked at me and asked." And she leaned into his hand and whispered, "Then I will never be alone again." The sky above them shimmered as a long-range human ship entered orbit, drawn by the beacon, by the signal of hope and memory, and Raiden stood holding Alara's hand as the rescue lights blinked from the clouds above, and he said, "Are you ready?" And she said, "Only if you are." They walked toward the landing site, not as mission and subject, not as protector and protected, but as two people bound by choice and by something more powerful than blood, something chosen, something earned. And as they climbed the hill to the ship, and the engines roared in welcome, Alara looked up at him one more time and said, "I called you father, and you stayed." And he said, "I stayed because you called me."